Hi, welcome. I am Melanie DiLorenzo. I'm an associate teaching professor in chemistry here, and I want to welcome you to the Connections Lecture Series. I want to acknowledge President Herbert joining us today. Thank you for joining us, but welcome to everyone who has come. I'm going to start by introducing our interim dean for CAS, Stina Brown. She's going to talk to you a little bit about the vision behind the Connections Lecture Series.
And the stage is low enough to just step up. I appreciate that. So thank you, Melanie. So as Melanie said, I've been asked to say a few words about the purpose and the vision of the Connections Lecture. I am thankful for this opportunity since this event is sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office. And I am especially thankful and grateful to the committee's work in getting this event together today. I really appreciate that. So the curriculum for undergraduates at UNE currently evolves around 4 themes: environmental awareness, social global awareness, critical thinking, and what it is to be a citizen. And the purpose of the Connections Lecture is to find an opportunity by which students can reconsider those themes and broaden and deepen their understanding of these themes throughout. So today is an opportunity to deepen some understanding of these themes within the core. It's also an opportunity for students to think about how they internalize this knowledge and can transfer that knowledge into different coursework that they're taking in their major or related to their core. It's an opportunity to build community. We have faculty, professional staff, students all present for this event, and I think that's important. And finally, an opportunity to get students outside the classroom engaging in timely topics. There was an opportunity last night with the President's Forum. We have an opportunity today. There are lots of these opportunities on campus, in fact, and to provide an opportunity for students to embrace learning in venues well beyond the classroom. That's also super important. And I encourage all faculty, sort of the vision behind this is encouraging faculty to integrate these presentations and to integrate these opportunities, not just Connections Lecture, but all of the events and opportunities across campus into what they're doing within the curriculum as well. So to bring together really an opportunity for expansive learning and to model lifelong learning and learning across the sweep of what we engage in our lives as human beings, as faculty, as students, as professional staff at the institution. So I hope you enjoy the event today, and I hope that sets somewhat of the framework for connections within the life of the College of Arts and Sciences. Thanks. Melanie.
So if you arrived thinking there were going to be refreshments, so did I. I don't know where they are. We're trying to track them down, but hopefully they arrive at some point. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Dr. Abouyoub is head of governance and state building for the Governance and Conflict Prevention Division of the United Nations Middle East and North Africa region. Dr. Abouyoub is the former head of the political office of the UN Undersecretary General for Conflict Prevention and senior political advisor for the UN Secretary General, Special Envoy to Burundi. In his current position, he oversees a diverse portfolio of programs on governance, public policy and administration, and institutional development for conflict prevention and sustainable development, which provides member states with substantive analysis, policy advice, technical assistance, capacity building, and knowledge sharing on a host of public governance and institutional matters. Dr. Abouyoub holds a Ph.D. in political sociology and master's and postgraduate degrees in geopolitics and law. He is a contributing author to the Oxford Encyclopedia of Modern History, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam, and the Routledge International Handbook of World Systems Analysis, the Encyclopedia of Global Human Migration. He has published numerous scholarly articles, op-eds, and contributed to edited books. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Abouyoub to the stage.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be with you in this campus. It's a lovely campus. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Professor Melanie, and thank you, Professor Amida. It's always a privilege to come back to academia. Coming from my work in international relations in the field, it's always refreshing to come back and talk about these issues. And see the interest in the audience about what's happening out there in the world. My field, originally academically, was political sociology, and especially sociology of power, which with time drove me to work in the world of diplomacy and international affairs with the United Nations, and mostly before the portfolio that I'm in charge of now in conflict negotiations and political transitions and post-conflict state building. Among different regions where I worked, starting from Sudan, Darfur, Kenya, Ethiopia, and more recently with the Arab Springs in Libya, Yemen, and other regions. So what I would like to talk about today to trigger the discussion about what we mean by political transitions in post-conflict settings. And I will structure my intervention in three parts. The first one, just talk briefly about the main ideas in literature and theories of political transitions that some of you know or don't, depends on your field. And then I will talk about some of the case studies, more recent ones in the region, where I worked. And I'll end up with what I call like key messages or lessons learned from the field. Because one of the first things that I discovered when I started doing what I'm doing is that while theory is important, it doesn't always fit when you work on the ground. That humans are not just figures, and we cannot just try to adapt people's behavior with always rational thinking and an Excel sheet, and if you do this plus this, you will end up having this. It doesn't work like this. And I learned it the hard way, because when I came fresh from academia, I started working in this field, I thought, oh, I have all the recipes, political transitions, building democracy, consolidation, and then that's it. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. So what are the main tenets of the political transition in post-conflict settings? Usually the first one is about, we always talk about democratic transitions. For me, there is no such a thing as a democratic transition. There is a political transition that can lead you either way. It can take you to democracy, it can actually take you to something even worse than we had before. And I'll talk about some cases. So when you talk about democratic transition, it's already, I think, a flawed concept. And most of the time when you have a country that is going through that transition, whether it's revolution or a coup, the first reaction, the first reflex out of these theories that have been built throughout decades, and especially with the democratic, quote-unquote, consolidation in the 90s in South American countries, the theory was that probably the fourth transition will be taking place in Middle Eastern countries. And that's what we thought would happen in 2011 with the Arab Spring. And based on this, the idea is the first thing you would do is you build legitimacy of a democratically elected government in a post-conflict situation, because most of the time people revolt because of non-representation, non-inclusiveness of political regimes, socioeconomic exclusion. It's about fairness. It's about being heard. It's about being represented in a polity. It's not about poverty. People don't revolt because they're poor. It's not true. I mean, they revolt because there's injustice, there is exclusion, there is authoritarianism. So the recipe was throughout this experience is basically you go out from this transition through an electoral process that provides you with a government that is legitimate in the eyes of citizenry. While this is an important thing, I mean, elections, until now, this is the only tool we have to make people's voices represented and heard in any polity. There's nothing better yet to be discovered. Maybe in the future we'll find something else. Representative democracy remains the lesser of all evils. But I don't think it's a recipe for all situations. It's a matter of prioritizing the interventions you do. Sometimes you have to start with this, sometimes actually it's not the right time. You have to work on something else. Because societies are different, countries are different. They have different socioeconomic histories, social histories, and political systems. So what could apply in Eastern European countries in the 90s out of communism does not necessarily apply in South America or Sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East and North Africa. I will, by the way, use a term Western Asia sometimes in the Middle East because in the UN we use Western Asia as geography, not because Middle East has a connotation, a political connotation. And by the way, a disclaimer, what I'm talking about here does not represent necessarily the views of the organization I work with. This is my own, these are my own opinions from the work that I've done. So electoral process. And then the third element is institutional building. And when you talk about institutional building, we mean different types of institution in a polity. First, we're talking about security institutions. So you have to do a DDR, which is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, if you have armed groups, because this is key. Or else you have, there's no possibility for the legitimate monopoly of violence that Weber talked about in the state. You have administrative institutions where are very key. It's how to reform the public administration, because the state is there to provide public services to their citizens. Healthcare, school, energy, water, all these things, which is most of the time one of the reasons why actually people revolt, because it's competition for resources. And then you have the judicial institutions, and that's about justice and rule of law, which is a key element and most of the time the most challenging ones. How to make sure you have independent judiciary from the executive. How to make sure that judges and all those who work in the law system are not corrupt. So this takes a long time. And then, of course, the fourth element, which is important, is the whole political system. What type of system are you going to put? Is it a presidential one? Is it a parliamentary system? Is it a mix between the two? And usually these are things, in theory, should be left to the people themselves to decide, because that's why actually they did what they did, whether it's a revolution or whatever. But from the experience, most of the time, the one that have the least voice in all these transitions are the people. Because at the end of the day, when you have a revolution or a coup and you have intervention from outside and you have the elite that are competing for power, most of the time it's the elite that are sharing power again in a different way. And the voices of the people, what we call civil society, can be sometimes there as a token. But in reality, it's very challenging to have them on board and be real actor. In all our work in the region and out elsewhere, there's a major component for our work is, first of all, do no harm. And the second, it's local representation. In any transition, you need to make sure that the people are heard in the political process. There are two other elements, but not used very frequently, which is the transitional justice system, whereby during the transition period you then have in place, especially if you have managed to build a good enough judiciary system, whereby you put a system that makes sure that there is no impunity. Those who committed crimes against humanity or against their own people will be brought to justice. In some cases, this is not done through the judicial way, but through some sort of open debate about what happened during the previous regime, and not always end up in a court. So transitional justice and reconciliation processes can be both, can be leading to legal persecutions or not. There are cases, for instance, in the case of South Africa, or the case in Morocco or Tunisia during 2011. And the last one is the national dialogue. And these are unfortunately, the less used tools for transitions, because that's where actually, if it gets the priority, that's how you build a more inclusive, more representative polity after a reconciliation. But most of the time, unfortunately, for different reasons, sometimes because time is not ripe, conditions are not there, or different spoilers and interventions make sure that this doesn't happen. We have to remember, no country is an island. You are part of a region, you're part of a world system. It's not only because you want to move from an authoritarian regime to democracy that it happens. And one final point before I talk about the cases that I want to mention, democracy at the end of the day is not a good that you manage to get something tangible. It's a process. It's a system whereby you resolve conflict in a peaceful way. And if you don't succeed in protecting it and really taking care of it daily and all the time, you reach a certain point where you have a setback. That's why around 60 to 70% of political transition suffer from setback, especially countries that come out of conflict. Within a range of 10 years, there's a conflict relapse because the major issues have not been resolved. And most of the time, because we have this tendency to look for quick fixes, you need a success story quickly to show that, see, it's different. Dictator is gone, and now we have something better. And we don't have, or don't give enough effort and time to dismantle the system itself, because dictatorship is not about a person, it's a system, it's very complex. No dictator can survive by himself. Now, these are the main elements or tenets of any political transition. How does it work when you are in the field and dealing with a different type of situation? I would start with the case of Tunisia, which was very easy. Actually, there are a few countries that I'll talk about. Each country could take actually hours to describe. But I will just give a few elements, and maybe during the Q&As we can develop further. Tunisia, why Tunisia is first because it's the starting point of what we call the Arab Spring. It was a peaceful transition. And it triggered a whole domino effect in the region. After it was Egypt, then Libya, then Yemen, and others. And until at least the last 2 years, we regarded Tunisia as one of the best examples in the region. Because it was, first of all, peaceful. It was very civilized transition, and most of all, there was no foreign intervention in Tunisia. It was all done by local actors, the quartet of civil society, lawyers, professional unions that decided to lead that transition and made sure that through a national dialogue they will build the basis for the next regime. Unfortunately, those 10 years will be very challenging in terms of social and economic development, because at the end of the day, Tunisians revolted because they wanted better conditions of living and also more voices and more freedom. The opposition that took over the Nahda party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood Tunisian party, did not succeed in achieving what most people were looking or aspiring to. And that led, even though there was a successful national dialogue with a new constitution that was drafted and adopted by a majority, there will be a setback with tacit foreign interventions that will counter all those achievements that were made during the decade towards what we are now. And then in terms of progress towards democratization, I think we're now suffering a setback in Tunisia. But it remains that there are two important elements that we don't see in other countries in the region. It's the peaceful nature of its transition, and it's the local element that played a major role. There was absolutely no, the United Nations did not intervene, the European Union, the African Union, or even the League of Arab States. This was all done by Tunisians themselves, which is an example that maybe could be learned from for other transitions in the future, because I don't think we're done with revolts and revolutions. The second one is Libya, and here my friend Professor Ali Amida knows a lot about these details. I actually learned a lot from his books and from my discussions with him. Libya is another case that is quite different and unfortunately not so peaceful as Tunisia. When I joined the mission in 2012 in Libya, actually after the fall of the regime, there was, there's a difference between Tunisia and Libya because Libya was a foreign intervention through a resolution by the UN for the first time under the right to protect doctrine. That's where for the first time it was implemented. Of course, in the 90s it was used in Yugoslavia, but it was never endorsed by the UN. It was a NATO intervention, but this time it was the UN through the Security Council resolution that gave right to the intervention in Libya. And I remember the discussion that took place after whether we should go for elections or not in 2012. That's why I mentioned at the beginning the issue of electoral processes. And in my opinion, there were two deadly mistakes that were made in Libya back then. First, in terms of rushing the electoral process, and second, what I called earlier DDR, the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, was actually done in reverse almost. I'll explain why. In the discussion we had back then, there were pro voices and those against the elections. Those who were for the elections, which were a majority, whether in the international community and Libyans themselves, they wanted to build legitimacy for the interim government because those who led the political aspect of the revolution needed a mandate from the people to govern. And the only way to do it is through elections. For the international community, with the violent intervention and the way things ended up in Libya, they wanted to show a success story that here is a country that comes from 42 years of dictatorship is now able to elect its leaders, and then we move towards a democratization process and consolidation. But where do I think the mistake was made is that we applied the recipe that worked in different other countries that could not work in the case of Libya. Libya, after 42 years of authoritarian, even a totalitarian regime, did not have that space for a political life, for unions, for institution that could be the basis on which you could build that the next system or regime. And by definition, elections in general, all over the world, divide people. They divide people along ideological lines. One is towards the left, one is center, one is pro-market, one is against. And in a country that didn't have political parties, where you had, at a moment, there was a momentum, there is a consensus in Libya that people did not want that old regime. When you when you immediately bring the issue of elections, what you do, actually divide, you break that consensus. So what was one people at a certain historical moment ready to build something together, you divided it. I was of the opinion, and some others, that what we should do is a longer transition, maybe 18 to 24 months, whereby you build the necessary and prioritize certain institutions on which you could put that new government. Mostly issue of security sector reform, for instance. New electoral law, an independent electoral commission, open for political parties, restore the issue of the army. A lot of things that could have done by an interim government who would then prepare and pave the ground for elections that should take place at a later stage. So because of those causes that I told you about, we prioritize almost power sharing deals instead of state building. And we ended up now, from 2011 until now, moving from one government to another, but without the state. And we keep doing the same mistake again and again and again. Because once you put, there are people who come to power, it's basically very difficult for them to just renounce it and then, so you just add another layer and layer. And we confused state with government or administration, where these two should have been separated. The second element was the issue of DDR. Mustafa Abdel Jalil, who was the chairman of the interim government back then, once the Gaddafi regime fell, wanted to show gratitude to the people who rebelled and fought during that short conflict. So he announced that he will give salaries to all the freedom fighters or rebels. While the whole principle of DDR is you disarm, you collect the weapons, and you put the programs for those armed personnel to reintegrate civilian life through civilian institutions or go to the private sector, or you integrate the national army or national police. But to do that, you need to build those institutions first. So all of a sudden, the whole process was actually put upside down. Instead of giving up your weapons and getting, in exchange, a salary or integration into civilian life, having a weapon became a guarantee for you to get a salary. So we moved from 7,000 armed, roughly, personnel to over 250,000 in a few weeks. Because they understood that, well, that's how you make money. You just bring an AK-47 and you say, okay, I fought. So, and this case is still until today, it's the problem in Libya, is that the militias that consolidated after that refused to give up their weapons, refused to integrate in the army, while you have the remnants of the army in the eastern part of Libya under Haftar. And we cannot resolve this illegitimacy. Who is legitimate now to carry weapons? The militia and rebels say the national army should integrate into us because we are the new army. And the old army says, no, we are the official army, so the rebels should integrate into us. And it's a debate that it has not been resolved. And we're still now talking about holding elections. But I think the momentum was missed. I'm not saying that it's too late to do anything. We can, but we need to reconsider this whole blueprint and roadmap that was flawed from the beginning. The third case is Yemen. Yemen was initially also a success story like Tunisia. Yemen has had one of the best and most successful national dialogue in the region. Of course, with a difference with Tunisia that Yemen was through a mandate, this was made under the auspices of the United Nations. There was a resolution that established a political mission in Yemen, and one of our role back then was to organize and facilitate the national dialogue. The national dialogue that lasted around 6 months touched upon almost everything and really created the blueprint for the post-conflict Yemen. And the document actually even exists. It's online. It's called the NDC Outcome Document that talks from socioeconomic issues, security sector reform, parliamentary issues to administrative organization of the country. But there was an issue, is that the president of Yemen that was elected more or less, I would say, because what we needed back then, because when the revolution took place, the first initiative came from the GCC, the Gulf Council, who decided that they will make sure that there's a peaceful and orderly transition. But that transition was very simplistic in a way. What they did is that they asked the late president to step down, and they asked his vice president to take over. There was an election. Actually, he was the only candidate. But his position was temporary. His job was supposed to be for 2 years, and his main task was to implement the agreements that were set in the national dialogue outcome. He will start with, because as I told you, there's always political interest in any power, in any regime. He will start dragging his feet in implementing these outcomes to make sure that his term gets renewed, and this created frustration with other political groups. And the key thing that will erupt in what will be known as the Houthi takeover of Yemen was in the disagreement over the administrative remapping of Yemen. And the issue was during the national dialogue was, is Yemen going to be a federal state or a centralized state? Because as you know, Yemen was divided into two countries, South Yemen and North Yemen, until 1991. So with this revolution, then all ghosts came back, and the southern Yemen wanted secession, then the north didn't want this. So, or do we have a federal Yemen with the north and south, and we divide the provinces in Yemen into 6 provinces or 2 provinces? That debate was not settled. So the decision was, let's adopt the national dialogue outcome, leave this issue, which was quite complex, to a technical committee that will be formed and representing all different views from Yemen. And then until that is resolved, then we can move and focus on other things. But in that case, the draft constitution should not be tabled for a referendum or adopted. President Hadi, because he had other calculations, surprised everyone and came out and said, that's it, the constitution is adopted and we move on. The Houthis and others said, no, we haven't decided how we're going to organize Yemen administratively. Anyway, long story short, the Houthis will take advantage of that conflict, that disagreement, and they will move towards Sana'a. Now, the Houthis were not strong enough to control Yemen. They are a minority of a minority because in terms of sectarian divide in Yemen, you have 2 major groups. You have the Sunni Shafi'i and you have the Zaydis. And the Zaydis are a minority compared to Shafi'is, 37% roughly. And the Houthis are even smaller within the Zaydis. But because they had a long history with the central government, they fought the central government for years. That's what we call the 6 Sada Wars. And the last one was in 2009. They will use that disagreement and move towards Sana'a. And because you have different interests and different competing interests in the army, those who are loyal to the current president, those who are still loyal to the former president, each one had his own calculation, and did not intervene to stop the Houthis from moving towards Sana'a, because each one thought that when the Houthis will come to Sana'a, they will take care of their enemies, which actually the Houthis understood very well and played the different parts against each other, and then the country just fall in their arms easily that way. Now, where the conflict will become even more complex is that when the Saudi-led coalition in 2015 will intervene. And then the whole transition, the whole problem that was a national one, a domestic one, becomes a regional one. Because as soon as the coalition intervenes to restore the legitimate government or the internationally recognized government, the Houthis had to seek alliances elsewhere to protect themselves. So it will turn towards Iran, which was not initially the plan, because the Houthis are not, in terms of sect, they're not Shia like Iran. I know that in most of mainstream media, they call it the Shia Houthi back. It's not, they're not Shia. Zaydis are not Shia the way Iranians are Shia. But for political expediency, and there's a war to fight, they had to resort to the help from Iran. And then that transition, which was successful at the beginning, under the auspices of the international community, moved from a domestic issue to an international, regional international. Especially now we see the role that the Houthis are playing in other conflicts. I don't know if I'm, okay. Two more countries, and I'll finish with one because it's important for the discussion later on. Sudan. Sudan is an interesting country in transition. To give you an example how quick fixes do not work, because you want to get something done now, but you don't realize that actually you're planting the seeds for the next conflict to come. Sudan has been almost in civil war since independence, since the 1950s. First, this north and south. Then you had this secession of the south from the north. Then you had the west, which is the Darfur conflict. And initially, Darfur, unlike the southern part of Sudan, was a country by itself. Darfur was a monarchy that was taken over by the British in 1918, dismantled, and will be added to Sudan under the Egyptian-Sudanese condominium under the British rule. So in a way, they have historically more legitimacy to claim a state that they had than the Southerners. But because of the issue of central government, issues of injustice, lack of resources, many different things, even when we tried to fix this north and south, which ended up with the void in Sudan with huge natural resources in terms of oil and creating another failed state. I mean, you probably heard the news about South Sudan now. Darfur had the same issues. And the way those issues were dealt with, they were always just a power agreement between fighting elites. And then you leave the main issues to a later stage. And they keep building up, building up, building up. So when you had the 2018 revolution in Sudan that toppled Omar Bashir, immediately the allied who were against Bashir, which are mostly the army, and the militias that were created by the army back then to fight the war in Darfur, the RSF, will both turn against the civilian government that led the transition. And once they get rid of the civilian government, you have then a competition between the two military leaders, Burhan and Hamiti. And the big mistake that was done in 2004, 2005, you know, when the militias were fighting in Darfur, they used to be called Janjaweed. They officialized them into the Rapid Deployment Forces, who are now fighting against the army. So you wanted to resolve a problem 25 years ago, and you planted the seeds for the current one. Sudan now is, for me, it's, I think, past a transition. It'll be very difficult to keep. I don't see Sudan staying as one country anymore. I think it's going to split into more. It's a very complex situation. The last one is also about quick fixes. It's Lebanon. And it's important for our discussion because we see what's happening today in Lebanon. In Lebanon, when the Taif Agreement was signed in 1991, it was also the result of the end of the Cold War, which has played a major element in how Lebanon was built the way it's built today. And it was built, my contention is that civil war in Lebanon never ended. Civil war in Lebanon was frozen in 1991. So those same military leaders just traded their weapons and their khakis for suits, and they become political leaders today. And the same political geography where the civil war ended is still today there. And we never managed to really build a state that is inclusive to all its different sects. And in terms of socioeconomic development, it was a built-in failed state since 1991. It only worked because the configuration of the first decade or two after the Cold War were supportive of that. But because you had issues in terms of regional dynamics, Iran, Hezbollah becoming more and more stronger political party and armed groups in the country, which stopped what was planned for Lebanon in terms of consolidating that agreement of Taif, making sure that, for instance, the Palestinians will remain and become Lebanese, providing the Sunnis with a huge electoral body that could help them in elections. All of this played against that plan to where we are now, before even the war started. I'm talking about the collapse, the economic and financial crisis in Lebanon, with the banking system failing and then everything else. So I will close now, but the key points that I wanted to make, what I call the 7 deadly sins of transitions. There are 7 points. First of all, elections are not a panacea. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. It's not about elections themselves, it's about how to prioritize your intervention. What should come first? 2, quick fixes are a recipe for disaster, because the quick fix can give you a nice success story you can report on today, but it most of the time builds or plants the seeds for the next conflict in a generation or so. 3rd, the issue of economic development, which is key. If you don't resolve the issue of resources and wealth sharing and unemployment and economic exclusion, you haven't done much, because that's key. 4th, there's no peace without justice. People don't forget. That's why it's very important to have a serious and fair transitional justice system. 5, national dialogue, which proved, as I explained to you in the case of Tunisia and Yemen, to be really successful if you give the time to people to sit and talk frankly with each other and agree and resolve the issues of the past. Unfortunately, national dialogues is a key instrument that is not used most of the time, because elites do not like that, because it gives power to the voiceless, and then it creates a more open system that threatens privileges. 6, state building cannot be traded for power sharing agreement. They don't resolve issues. And 7th, issue of foreign interventions, which is never ever mentioned in literature. Foreign interventions are always mentioned in a positive light. Mediation, support, this, which is true, but it's not always the case. If you look at the region now, you can see the proxy wars that is playing in the region. Those for, those against, revolution, counter-revolutionary. It is key. And as long as we don't look at this and speak about these issues frankly, most of these transitions will be just recipe for more disaster. Thank you very much.
I've got a microphone. Just put up your hand if you have a question.
Thank you so much for talking to us about many of these cases. Not a case you've talked about, but I think about the role of the UN outside forces. And of course, we have horrifying situation in Gaza. And I'm curious about your thoughts about the limits of the UN when we have votes in the UN about the war crimes that have been well documented, being live streamed. And then you talked about the foreign interventions. The US is sending billions of weapons to Israel. And I'm curious about how you see that playing out, that dynamic between the United Nations and then very powerful countries that but are obstacles potentially to peace and state building in the future.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the United Nations, at the end of the day, is just a reflection of the balance of power in the real world. The United Nations is not a supranational organization. It does not preclude the sovereignty of states, even though the agreement is when you join, you accept a certain limit to your sovereignty. But actually, in reality, the UN does not have an executive mandate over any country, with very few exceptions when you are put under Chapter 7. But most of the time, countries are free to do whatever they want. If you want to talk about it in the real politique, the UN is the result of 1945 world. Most of the countries of the world that joined the UN later on were not independent states back then. So decisions were made before they joined. Mechanism of international system governance were made in the 50s. Most global South countries joined in the 60s and 70s, which explain why after the Cold War and after the decade after the Cold War, even 15 years, where the UN was, the US was the only power in the multilateral system that was leading it, now you reach a point where that system doesn't work anymore, which shows in the challenges of the work of the UN. Now you have emerging economies and countries that want to have a stronger voice in the way international affairs are dealt with. The Security Council now is divided, as you can see. You have the dichotomy between the prerogatives of Security Council and those of the General Assembly. General Assembly with 193 member states can issue all the resolution it wants. They are mere recommendations. They're not legally binding. The only legally binding resolutions are those of Security Council. And there's discussion about reform for the last 2 decades. Now there's this proposal that has been tabled to add 2 more permanent members to the Security Council, one for Africa and one for South America. But it does not resolve the problem, because some countries, while they accept the idea, they don't want to give up the veto, or doesn't want to share that veto power with others. So I'm afraid, like everything else in history, the new global order will only come after a major conflict. Then those winning, or if there's a tie, will rearrange the global system. But with all its failures, I think a world without the United Nations or something like it will be much worse than one with it.
I also have a question regarding similar situation. You talk about the barriers in Yemen and Lebanon to a true democratic transition being the Houthi and Hezbollah, respectively. And I just was wondering your thoughts on the way Israeli aggression has bolstered the popularity of these groups within Hezbollah, and, within Lebanon and Yemen, just when they see these are the people taking up arms against invaders and aggressors. It bolsters their popularity quite a bit in the country, and what paths you may see forward from that.
Well, first, just an observation. I did not say that Houthis or Hezbollah are the obstacles toward democratization. No. What I said is that they are the result of failed transitions of injustices that were never repaired or adjusted. When you don't have a state that is representative of its people, providing services, and what the role of a state, then you open up the space for different political representations, be they armed or non-armed. That's where now it's more often called as rebel governance. And this happens in most of the time in failed states. And this is unfortunately what we see in most of the region. Now, in terms of your question, of course, the issue of Palestine has been one of the reasons why moving towards a transition process to a more open or more democratic regime has always failed in the region. Because there's those who did not want to open up their system because they say, oh, this is not the right time. We have a war to fight. And they used Palestine to make sure that the regimes don't change. And those also, on the other side, who think that, rightly or wrongly, that a successful Palestinian revolution could be a threat to their existence as regime. Be it as it may, the fact that the Palestinian issue has never been resolved will plague this region for years and not decades to come. It has stopped any form of democratization. It has stopped any form of socioeconomic development. It has stopped regional integration and bolstered this rebel governance. Because when the state is not capable of protecting its citizens, then others do it. And of course now, their popularity is very high in the region, despite the fact that it is not always internally a big consensus. Lebanon is divided. You have those who are pro, those who are against. I mean, we have to acknowledge that. And the Houthis, despite the fact that they gained legitimacy de facto by doing what they're doing, there's also a large population in Yemen, especially in the south, that don't agree with them. So this is a layer that makes the transition even more complex now. You had layers from domestically, now it's regionally, internationally. I think there was a question there in the back.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I could take the rest of everybody's time and more hours this afternoon. So one sort of maybe meta question about the role of the UN, sort of across this larger scope of time. I mean, you mentioned this long-standing concern that people have pointed to. There's this the sort of imperial foundations of the United Nations, right? It's formed in 1945. The most powerful actors are active empires at the time of its formation, and many of the country member states are not even independent at the time, and so forth. And on the sort of other end of that same dialogue, you know, I read people like Tom Weiss and these sort of commentators who say, look, all of that's important, and until you acknowledge that to the populations that are trying to work with the UN, you'll get no sort of legitimacy. While at the same time saying, but in fact, you know, non-governance in the international system doesn't work. What we actually need is an international government.
Yeah.
The kinds of problems without borders that we're facing now, nuclear proliferation and climate change and so on and so on, they actually demand the very thing that people are reasonably hesitant to empower the global body to act on. I was just wondering if you could comment on that big sort of paradox briefly.
Yes, absolutely. I think you're right. Look, the world is messy. So, like, humanity needs to be organized one way or the other. I'm not necessarily talking about an international government, but we can talk about an international parliament. We need an institution where we can resolve and discuss the issue of global nature peacefully. And if you don't have that, then we're back into a Hobbesian world. The fittest survive, and then it will be conflict and war of all against all. That's the only way you can resolve this. I don't talk about an international government because then how would you ensure a representation of 7 billion people, voices? And I know that there's a lot of people, actually, one of the reasons why we see now a nationalist right rising in Europe, it's because of this, because they don't believe that the European Commission, for instance, represent them. You could listen to a French farmer saying, why do I have to apply the European Commission rules? It's destroying my business. Or you see this in Hungary, or now more and more in Germany and Austria. So can you imagine if we do this internationally? But we need a system. We need a system that is based on fairness. A system, when I say system, it's not only political, it's actually economic also, because the major issue, the elephant in the room, is the economic system. And we talk about reforming the governance system internationally. You're talking about also Bretton Woods institutions, which actually have even more power, I think, than the UN today. It's all economics. So if you don't have, if we don't agree on the fundamentals of this system, are we in for the idea that we all live on this planet and we need to base this system on solidarity and human partnership? Or you want to build it on competition? It's very basic, but based on what we decide with these two basic ideas, then we can build a system. The technicalities can come afterwards. But if you think that you want a system that is based on more and more competition, I think we already see the results and where we're going. We saw, for instance, what happened during COVID. Those who could afford vaccine, those who could not afford vaccine. You had the debate of those who say, no, I don't want vaccine to be imposed on me. You need a state in a society organize itself. You need something also globally, but not something that is centralized, that it imposes its rules. It's more, I see it more like a parliament. And I believe in more of a John Locke and the Rousseau way of organizing than the Hobbesian system. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming to speak to us. My question is, would you consider post 9/11 Iraq to be one of those like quick fix situations that you had discussed in the case studies?
What do you mean by post 9/11?
Like early 2000s, like 2000 to like 2012, 2014.
Well, what I meant by, I said the international system shifted after the end of the Cold War, and we moved from a bipolar system in the Cold War with Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. We moved to an era, after 9/11 especially, where it was unipolar. It was the US leading the world. That era is ending now. They have voices saying, this doesn't work. We are also here, we need to be heard. We have the China rising, you have Russia, you have Brazil, you have India, you have that group called the BRICS. So you have attempts now of organizing a different multilateral system. So I think we reaching a point, and we should reach it sooner than later to avoid more conflicts. Because if we keep going down this line, I think there will be more conflict in the world. So we have to sit and decide before things get ugly, especially that now with the environment crisis, this is not something that will touch one and not the other. This is the whole humanity. And it cannot be resolved nationally or even regionally. It has to be at the international level. And definitely, I think, whether it's the UN or a UN 0.1 or 0.2, I don't know in the future what it will be, you need something that learns from the lessons of the past, that no one alone can drive, whether nationally or internationally, the whole humanity. And then we need to build consensus and discuss issues instead of resorting to a violent conflict.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you all for coming. We do have a panel discussion this afternoon from 4 to 5 in the St. Francis room, so you are welcome to join us for that as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Abouyoub,
Thank you.
for joining us today.
Thank you.